Camera rolling.
Rolling.
Sound check rolling.
So, Richard Howard, could you briefly introduce yourself? Just your name, maybe where you're from, where you live right now.
My name is Richard Loveman. I'm overpronouncing my last name because some people will not believe it, so I make a point of saying it that way, but it is Loveman. I am originally from Palos Verdes, and I moved to Northern California and then to Texas, and I spent 20 years in Texas with my then wife, and in that period of time we decided to get some exotic animals, and one of the exotic animals was a capybara.
Great. For anyone who's never heard of a capybara, how would you describe what a capybara is?
A capybara is like a giant guinea pig, and when I say giant, I mean over 100 pounds. A guinea pig is less than a pound, so it's probably the size of a really big dog. It's built differently because it's a semi-aquatic, so it is much sturdier in terms of its build, but it's not dissimilar from a big dog in size.
How would you describe your life before you got your pet?
Well, I got two capybaras. The first one, before having a capybara, I had a lot more freedom because having a capybara is a lot of work and a lot of time. So before that capybara, I was free to do things when I wanted to and not have to go to the grocery store every day to buy corn and lettuce and things. After that first capybara, it was a lot of fun, but it was a lot of work and a lot of taking care of the capybara and making sure that it's things are clean. And by things, I mean that sometimes when they poop, we had to throw that in the toilet, and so there was a whole thing that it had no smell, but there was a lot of cleaning, a lot of work.
Okay, great. Could you describe how, when, and why you wanted to get a capybara in the first place?
Well, it wasn't my idea. I was always opposed to most of the pets, but once we committed to getting one, I was on board. My wife, my then wife, wanted to get a capybara because it was so unusual, and didn't know whether it would be an appropriate pet for indoors. It turned out it was fine, but we had enough outdoor area where we could have kept it like a goat. What I've found with all the pets that we've had is the more you treat them like a dog, the more they act like a dog, and so they behave better indoors if you train them to behave better indoors. So the capybara was actually pretty house trained immediately, because it would do its business in water, and so we just had a big bucket for that. And then in terms of how getting a capybara surprised us, we found that it wasn't that dissimilar from a dog, other than it eats a lot of food, because dogs eat protein, and protein is dense in terms of calories, but capybaras eat grass and grass-like items, and so they have to eat 10 pounds of food a day to keep up with things.
You described you grew really close with the second capybara who you named Gary. Did you expect to fall so in love with him or him?
The first capybara bonded with my wife at the time, and so I think that those things work mutually. So the second capybara, I was spending a lot more time at home at that time, and so he bonded very closely to me and wasn't as friendly to my then wife. And because he was close to me, I was close to him. He would sleep with me. He would follow me around the house and the yard, and he was tracking me closely. And verbally, he would react to things I would say and say things back, and it was sort of a mutual thing. And no, I didn't expect to get that close because I kind of always wanted to keep my distance. Just because, the pets were more my wife's thing. But after he became closer to me, I really reciprocated, and so that's how I became close to my capybara. Gary, go ahead.
Who gave you the name Gary?
So Gary was an adoptee. The first capybara died, and there was already a person in Ohio who had a capybara they couldn't really manage and take care of, and they were looking for somebody to take it, and we weren't interested in having two. But when Kaplan died, the first capybara, we decided to take in Gary, and at that point in time he was 45 pounds out of 100 that he would eventually be, but he was underweight for his age, so we knew we had to do a lot of work to get him healthy. It turns out that she didn't know. She kept him inside the house, the person in Ohio, and didn't give him the right kinds of food and let him get outside and do the right kind of grazing. And so we had the challenges of exposing him to the outside, which he was not used to, and developing his normal, natural capybara affinity for water and grazing and other foods that we found that he would eat.
So could you finally describe what happened to Gary and just that whole experience of finding out about his
So when Gary grew up, he was somewhat distorted from his early upbringing, or that's what we theorize. And so his bone structure was wrong, and so he ended up with some bone bacterial disease. And so we were having to take him to the vet school, which is the only place that would deal with him because he was such a weird pet. And that was over 100 miles away, and we did that like 12 different times. And we were not making progress against this disease, but we were kind of arresting it. And then ultimately, his last visit, and the disease was really manifesting in his giant mandible, so it was in his teeth. The vet dentist accidentally pushed some of the bacteria into his bloodstream, and he died 4 days later. And I was devastated for at least 6 months after that, and didn't really want to get another capybara because the pain of that occurrence was too much for me to handle.
Yeah, so what kind of ways did you try to cope? Did you try to
Well, actually, I did have a way of coping with it because I didn't really want another capybara because I didn't want to go through that trauma again. I decided I would take my then wife to a zoo that had a pair of capybaras, and we became friends with the people at the zoo and ended up going into the enclosure with the capybaras and training them and visiting with them every week. And so it was like a lighter version of owning one, but owning one was something outside of what I wanted to do. But my wife insisted on getting one, and ultimately that led to my divorce because the capybaras are so intensive in their requirements that she wanted to build onto the house for that new capybara. And between the fact that I didn't really want another one and I didn't want to spend a lot of money building onto the house for the new one, I didn't get close to the new one. So she has that new one now. It's a female. It's not a very affectionate one. The other two that we had were very affectionate with us. And so that's obviously her situation. I moved back to California where I was originally from, and I have looked back, but not very much, to Texas.
So, did you think anything in your life might have changed after you moved back to California? Something.
Well, one thing that changed was I moved in with my mother, and she had a dog, and I was taking care of the dog somewhat like the capybara, so I guess I kind of fell into that mode. But recently the dog got cancer and we had to put it down, and so one of the things I think that changed is that I think when you first have animals, you have a very hard decision to put them down if they're in a disease situation. But I think now I've learned that sometimes the efforts that you put in are torture for the animal.
And what would you say was your fondest memory of Gary?
My fondest memory of Gary was swimming in the pool with him and throwing him back like a kid and twirling him around. Gary was, most capybaras don't like spinning around, at least the ones we know from other people. But Gary had a unique interest in doing that. He would always try to do flips and turns. So he would even be somewhat competitive against himself. We could twirl him around like 15 times in the water, and he was pretty excited about that. So I guess just playing with him in the pool was probably my fondest memory of him.
Great. And what does it, for you personally, what does it mean to have to own a pet, and how did your kids think of you owning capybaras?
Well, the kids had moved out of the house, so it was just me and my wife at that time. They thought that it was crazy. The first capybara was actually reluctant to let them be at the house for more than a day. He would actually not really attack them, but fake attack them. So the first capybara was very territorial. So their relationship with that capybara was not good. My relationship with that capybara was very good. The second capybara was very gentle and didn't have any of those behavioral problems. But the closeness of, a person to this kind of a pet is confusing to people because they think that, you can only be close to a dog or a cat. But it seems like, at least with my experience, that I've been close to a rabbit and a capybara and some other things, and even a chicken. The amount of work and time and relationship you build with the animal, makes a big difference. But we have a lot of responsibility as people, just being able to keep things for them perfect, just like you would with a child.
And finally, is there anything else that you would like to add about your experience with Gary?
I think that the capybaras are a really good species for pets. I think that they're probably similar to a goat for most people, but a lot of people don't have property where they could have a goat. It's not an appropriate pet for somebody in the city, obviously, but for somebody who's got some land, which I know in California that's pretty rare. I guess the other thing is that the first capybara that somebody had as a pet was here in California. It was Cappy Boppy. There was an ex-Disney cartoonist whose son got a capybara in 1960, And the reason we know about that is he did little cartoon books, and his best book and his most famous book is Cappy Boppy. And that capybara pretty much treated his family similar to what we had in terms of a relationship. The problem they had was they had neighbors coming in and out, and capybaras are somewhat territorial, so they don't like strangers so much. But if you're in a situation where there aren't that many strangers around and things can be managed, it's not a big deal. And of course, the personality changes from one to the next, so there's always that. That capybara ended up at the Los Angeles Zoo, and some unfortunate things happened to him after that. But they were pretty pleased with a capybara as a pet, and there's now over 50 people with capybaras as pets because of us. And they're pretty pleased with the capybaras as pets. Can't have one in California.
Would you ever want another pet in your future?
I will have to be in a living condition that I think is like a 10-year living condition. Right now I'm not feeling like I'm going to be where I am or doing what I'm doing for 10 years. So I think that a pet is like a child. You really have to be able to think way into the future before you assume that it's going to work out for that pet. I mean, you can do things with cats and dogs. They're pretty flexible, so you can move and it's not going to affect them. But with something like this, you really need to be planning your 10-year period. That, by the way, these two capybaras both lived only 4 years, but that's unusual. They probably could live up to 18 years, and they probably averaged living up to 8 years. And the second one obviously died from some bad treatment, but the first one died for unknown reasons. So that's the thing about pets, is sometimes you really have no idea how long they're going to live, and you can't really assume that it's going to be a short time. So how many minutes was that?
It's probably like a little over. You okay, Elsa?
Yeah.
Sweaty?
It's kind of sore.
Cool.
Do you guys want to put it again?
You want to look at it real quick and see what it's like?
Yeah, check it for a minute.